Stage. So as they do that, good afternoon. My name is Anna Siefken, and I'm with the Scott Institute for Energy Innovation. We're going to move right into our next panel. We have two panels before our next break. And this panel is on the insights and innovations in natural gas and traditional fuels. So our moderator for this session, I'm very honored to introduce Dr. Jared L. Cohon is the President Emeritus and University Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering and Public Policy. And he's the Wilton E. Scott Institute for Energy Innovation Director Emeritus at Carnegie Mellon University. Dr. Cohon will be the moderator of this panel, and he served as Carnegie Mellon's 8th president from 1997 to 2013. During that time, the university made progress on many fronts, including teaching and research, international activities, diversity, and economic development in Southwest Pennsylvania. Dr. Cohon is the former director of CMU's Wilton E. Scott Institute for Energy Innovation. Morgan O'Brien also joins us. He's closest to me here. He's the president and chief executive officer of Peoples Natural Gas Company, LLC. In this capacity, he's responsible for the company's strategic, operational, and financial performance. Under his leadership, Peoples' mission is to make the lives of all of its customers better. Pat Getty has been the president of the Claude Worthington Benedum Foundation since 1999. In addition to his Vision Shared board position, he's a member of the governing board of Imagine West Virginia, Vision Shared's Independent Policy Institute. He also serves on the policy committee of the Southwestern Pennsylvania Commission and is a fellow of the University of Pittsburgh Institute of Politics. Michael Marr joins us from Shell Pennsylvania Chemicals, where he is the business innovation lead. He's been both a senior communications leader in both the private and public sector for more than 2 decades. In 2012, Marr joined Shell and has since worked in different roles covering Shell's U.S. chemical assets and Shell's petrochemical project in Beaver County, Pennsylvania. Stacy Olson, in the center, is the president of Chevron Appalachia, LLC, a position she assumed in June of 2016. She's responsible for leading Chevron's business unit that develops natural gas from shale in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. Olson also is a board member of both the Center for Responsible Shale Development and the Allegheny Conference on Community Development. David Ruppersberger is here. He's the president of the Pittsburgh Regional Alliance, an affiliate of the Allegheny Conference for Community Development. He's been active in the Pittsburgh high-tech community for over 30 years. His experience includes senior management positions with Unisys, Symbolics, and Carnegie Group, Inc., CEO positions for 2 high-tech startups in the Pittsburgh area, and a partnership in a retail business. He served on many local boards and is an executive fellow in the Center for Economic Development at Carnegie Mellon's Heinz College, and he has a degree in economics from the University of Pittsburgh. And with that, I'd like to welcome all of our esteemed panelists for our session. Jerry, I'll send it over to you.
Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you all for being here for this panel. The Marcellus Shale formation is the largest shale gas formation in the country, largest in the sense of potential for producing natural gas. As you know well, anybody from this region, it's a formation that we've been exploiting now for about 10 years, I guess, in earnest. And we will continue for many decades to come. One of the questions is, and the central question is, what are the benefits and what are the costs to this region of the development of that Marcellus Shale resource? Are we realizing the benefits? Are we maximizing the benefits that we can get from that resource? Are we minimizing the cost, or at least containing the cost? Today we're going to explore that with these outstanding panelists. It's really a wonderful group. that will complement each other very well, as you will hear as we proceed. We're going to start with you, Pat Getty from the Mellon Foundation. We thought a lot about this question of getting the most out of the Marcellus Shale resource, how this region can most benefit from it. And I should add and reinforce and cue Pat that he's thought about this from a truly regional perspective, not just Western Pennsylvania, not just Pennsylvania, but in fact Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia. Pat, give us your thoughts about this.
Thank you. The Mellon Foundation has what for a long time was just a curious geography. We serve all of West Virginia and southwestern Pennsylvania, but with the advent of the shale opportunity, that curious geography has become pretty relevant. We've been able to engage in regional efforts to try to, truly in my mind, try to maximize the opportunity, which I think a friend of mine once described by saying that prosperity flows to where value is added to a raw material. And I can assure you, every West Virginian understands this essentially from birth because they've seen the value, the prosperity creation from coal happen in places like Pittsburgh and Cleveland and Detroit. And what they're left with is the decline in jobs and whatever the impacts in health and environmental have been. That's the way West Virginians see it. So they really understand that with this gas being underfoot, what is really important is not just to drill it and ship it, but to actually add value to it in the region. And I'm convinced that the region has a generational opportunity to develop modern manufacturing around products that are at least in part petrochemical in origin, things like carbon fibers, all kinds of endeavor. It won't be manufacturing like I knew 72 years ago when I was born here, but I think it's a tremendous opportunity, and I think we tend to focus on Carnegie Mellon and Pitt and UPMC, obviously, if we're in Pittsburgh, but if you get outside of Allegheny County, the region is not prospering, and this is really a chance to change that, and so that's on the benefit side, for sure, as I would say.
Thanks, Pat. Actually, taking this sort of a layer deeper, Stacy Olson, the regional head of Chevron, you joined forces with Peoples Gas to do a study on just this question of how to maximize the benefits from shale gas production. Forging the future, you called it. Could you tell us about that and what your findings were, what your recommendations were?
Sure. So let me just say that it's not just a large gas resource for the U.S. It's one of the largest gas resources in the entire world. So it is truly, truly significant. As you said, last year, Morgan and I teamed up, and we worked with a consultant to really try and quantify this question of what is the true economic potential. And that's important now because only a fraction of the resource has actually been produced. So if you're going to try and maximize the economic benefit, now is the time. And what we found was it quantified that there was the potential for $60 billion of GDP growth, 500,000 family-sustaining jobs, and as much as $3 billion in tax revenue to the state if the right strategies could be put in place to maximize the long-term economic value from the resource.
Thanks, Stacey. I'm going to move now to Dave Ruppersberger. So you heard Dave is from the Pittsburgh Regional Alliance, and not everybody knows what that is. Just to help you understand, suppose you were a company in Seattle and you were thinking about opening a second headquarters, just suppose. You would go to the Pittsburgh Regional Alliance to find out whether Pittsburgh was for you. Not to put you on the spot, Dave, but you'll be happy to know today's agenda is not about Amazon. But you're out there and you've got a sense, I think, better than any of us, of this kind of overall opportunities and barriers to downstream development related to natural gas. Tell us what you know.
So we've been focused primarily on an aspect of the natural gas that not everybody in other regions has the advantage that we do. Our gas is wet gas. So from Murraysville west, about 25% of what comes out of the ground is a combination of ethane, propane, and butane, which surely can be used as fuel sources, just as the dry methane can, but also serves as a feedstock for chemicals. So the ethane gets turned into ethylene and then into polyethylene, which is what Shell is going to be doing. Similar fashion, you can take propane into propylene and polypropylene and make plastics materials with that. Those are markets that are growing nationally and internationally. I tend to think that you should look more regionally for those markets because most of it's transported in pipelines. So in North America, for instance, we use about 3.4 million barrels of natural gas liquids every day, and that's projected to double by 2026. So a lot of growth in that market in particular. We have also some advantages here I want to point out about our ethane in particular. We have a lot of it. Right now we're exporting almost all of it. In fact, we are exporting all of it except for what we're burning as fuel. But we have enough ethane here to supply the Shell cracker, continue to export exactly what we're exporting now, and we have enough left over for 4 or 5 more crackers, the scale of Shell. The other thing is it's the cheapest ethane in the world. It's estimated we have about a 30% cost advantage over any other ethane in the world, which means we can take it and we can do things with it, as Pat was alluding to, add value, create plastic pellets, and ship them anywhere in the world, with the possible exception of China, more cheaply than anybody else can. But the other advantage we have is we don't need to ship, excuse me, to foreign markets because within 700 miles of the Shell cracker is 70% of the North American marketplace for the product that they're going to produce. So that's a huge advantage as well.
Dave, before we let you go, I want to make sure. So one of the things I know the Alliance, as part of the conference, focuses on a lot is the regional labor force. And the kinds of downstream development you're talking about requires a particular labor force to support it. What's the take on that supply? Do we have the people we need to support those jobs?
So there's actually a part that comes before that, which is do we have enough labor to build it? And that was a real challenge for us. And as an economic developer, we don't often talk about union labor when we're trying to recruit people to Pittsburgh, but I can tell you without a doubt that this project would not have been completed without the full support of 12 trade unions in Pittsburgh. They pulled together, got the workforce together, convinced Shell that if they didn't have enough people, they could train enough people to make this happen. Once it's operational, there's another 600 people, very highly technical jobs that are going to be required inside the fence to support this, but probably 2 or 3 times that many jobs outside the fence in other supply chain-oriented companies. And we're working very hard with partners like the Beaver County Community College, other partners in the region to make sure that the workforce is there, and I'm sure Michael can help on that as well.
It'd be natural to segue to Michael and Shell, but before we do, I want to sort of lay out the full extent of the downstream opportunities and call on Morgan O'Brien, the President and CEO of Peoples Gas, to tell us a bit about the retail side, but also, Morgan, this audience would not necessarily know, though a lot of Carnegie Mellon people would. Morgan's been a real visionary when it comes to the environmental side of the retail distribution of natural gas, and I want to make sure you say something about the partnership you've got with CMU on methane leaks.
Sure.
But so the retail side and the kind of environmental leakage side.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the retail side, I mean, I think Stacy started with the study that we did and having a real analytics around the potential. And one of the areas that we know is evident is that about more than half of the people who live in the state of Pennsylvania don't have access to natural gas, which in a state that's housing the largest gas reserve in the entire country and one of the largest in the world, it feels like that's clearly a huge opportunity, both for the market to develop here, but also to make sure that everybody in Pennsylvania has access to it and has the ability to enjoy the benefits. And we literally 2 years ago started going in. We're mostly talking rural communities here. I know it's close to Pat's heart, but these are communities that are lower to middle class, and they can save on average between $1,000 to $1,500 a year in heating costs by converting to gas. And so it's a huge economic opportunity for, I'll say, the average person to have a meaningful benefit coming from all this incredible gas that we have. But the other side of it is as people start thinking about, and I was interested in the mayor of San Juan who was here talking about the grid and the reliability. My background was 20 years at Duquesne Light before I came to Peoples. And the idea of creating microgrids and the ability to take this natural gas because it's so plentiful, so reliable, it's produced right here, and utilize that to convert it to gas. And we're starting to see more and more of folks thinking about that aspect, as well as when we hear about nuclear and coal and the challenges there, the opportunity to grow the grid with more gas being generated here and being truly economic. When I came over from Duquesne Light, Jared described me as visionary. I actually would describe myself as being scared. I was so excited about the economic opportunities for the region and to be able to play a part in that as a utility. The biggest fear I had is that I would screw it up and that my company would screw it up under my leadership. And so one of the first things we did was we reached out, as I tell folks, to the smartest people I know, which are the folks here at Carnegie Mellon University. And this is not a paid advertisement. It's literally the first folks we reached out to. And what I'll say our focus had never been, and we knew it had to be, were on all the environmental issues, not with necessarily fracking and the production of gas, but literally distributing it through the streets of Pittsburgh and through all the communities where everybody lives. And we knew, I knew the issues of having old infrastructure, having been at Duquesne Light, having lived in Western Pennsylvania, seen the bridges and the roads, and knowing all the infrastructure issues that this part of the country has. We also have old water and gas lines underground that we don't think about. And so for us, we began immediately accelerating the replacement of that old pipe and replacing it as quickly as we could, as fast as we could manage it. But we really didn't have our hands around what were those environmental issues from having all this old pipe. And so through a partnership with Carnegie Mellon University, we've literally been, over the last couple of years, been going up and down the streets of Pittsburgh, measuring the methane emissions coming from our old pipes. And that was really important for us to understand, one, this is a real issue. It's an important issue for people who live in this community. And if we didn't address it and take ownership of it, there's a strong likelihood we're going to screw this opportunity up. And so the folks at CMU, we've really integrated them into what we call our risk management process, where we prioritize pipeline replacement. Historically, for 100 years, it's based purely on reliability, trying to make sure we're reliable, getting people their gas. We began a new priority, which overlaid that with the environmental issues. So where we had significant environmental issues, all of a sudden a piece of pipe went high up on the pecking order for replacing that pipe. We also had the folks from CMU measure the impacts on the air that we're breathing from the pipeline replacement. So it was really a before and after. And so we're at the point now where we're going to begin literally describing to the communities that we're serving, one, the issues that we're causing by having these old pipes, and then the benefits of the pipeline replacement on the air that we're breathing. The next phase, which the folks from CMU, I think from the beginning were anxious to do, was not just to help us prioritize the old pipe based on leakage, but actually be able to predict, before we had leakage, the replacement of those pipes. And so that's really the next phase of our partnership, which is really exciting. So this is not fixing environmental issues, but avoiding those environmental issues. And so I don't think it's visionary. I think it's fear of screwing up everything these folks are talking about. But it's been incredibly enlightening to people in my industry and the people that are working for me to have some really smart, I'll call them kids, because I'm an old person, coming into our offices, sitting down with our engineers and educating them, and our folks embracing it, which was obviously an important part of this. But we truly, I think, are creating a different priority system from a utility perspective than I'd say most utilities have ever had. And that's why I'm here today. I can't say enough about Carnegie Mellon and the incredible asset that it is for this region.
Well, thanks for the promotion. But whether it was fear or vision, the key thing was you innovated. And innovation affects not only the production side, but also the environmental impact side. And it's a great demonstration of that. It's a good segue to Michael Mann from Shell Chemicals. And as you all know, and as you heard already, Shell is building a very large cracker facility up in Beaver County. And I happen to know just from prior interactions with Michael that Shell takes this idea of innovation in environmental protection very seriously. It's important to lay the groundwork, though, first. You can't do these things without having some environmental impact. You can't distribute gas, you can't produce gas, and you can't use the gas downstream in producing products without having some environmental impact. But what you can do is to be innovative and do your best to minimize those impacts. So Michael, tell us what you're doing with your cracker.
Well, thank you for the question. Actually, I'm going to build thematically on what Morgan was speaking of, and how companies are really incentivized, both for environmental and then economic reasons, to do a more thorough and better job of keeping their products in the pipe and preserving them so that they can be produced into something, as Pat said, that's value adding. So I'll talk a little bit about a typical manufacturing facility. It could either be a refinery or a chemical plant, and then talk about how we're doing things a little bit differently, where we're innovating to offer an environmental benefit to the region and ultimately, we believe, an economic benefit to us as well. So a typical manufacturing facility will have a flare, which is a safety and environmental device where you have an operational upset. To relieve pressure from that operational upset, you send a stream of gas or some mode of product up the flare to relieve the pressure situation that's occurring literally at the ground level. And most of the emissions, but not all, most of the emissions are burned off at the flare. So, and 98, 99% when I say most, but still, when you have a flaring incident, that particularly one that goes for a long time, at a plant of a large scale, the emissions numbers that have to be reported to the regulator are typically pretty large. So what we did at this plant was we developed sort of an internal pipeline network where we will circulate the ethane if we have an upset, and we'll be able to do this for approximately 24 hours. So if you have a situation in a plant wherein within a shift or a shift or two, they're typically 12-hour shifts, you could fix the whatever the issue was that was causing the upset. We will have circulated the ethane, not have all the emissions that would have been reported, and while there's an upfront cost for us to build that, on the back end, after years of operating, there'll be a benefit because we wouldn't have wasted all the ethane that we will have had to send to the flare. So that's not something that you would typically see down in the Gulf Coast or other parts of the world. It is, I know it involves pipes and an industry that people don't normally think about innovative, but it is a way we've looked at things differently and see how we can offer both an environmental benefit to the region immediately and ultimately an economic benefit to us as well.
Thank you, Michael. I want to come back to the downstream development part of this, and I'm sure the environmental side will come up later as well. And come back to you, Pat, and you, Stacy, to get a little more specific about the kinds of strategies or steps we ought to be taking as a region to maximize that benefit. Now, Pat, I know you've worked to get the three states to cooperate together. Can you say some more about that? What kind of cooperation there is going on within the region?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. Actually, the governors of Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio signed an agreement in October 2015 to collaborate around downstream economic development. And that agreement was just re-upped for another 3 years the week before last in Houston. And that's very unusual in my experience. And not all that many years ago, the Benham Foundation annual report was on the issue, can regionalism ever happen? And the conclusion of the experts we interviewed was, probably not. And there's nothing like an opportunity to turn things around. But one of the main projects that's going to be critical of the development is creating storage infrastructure. And I have to call on Brian Anderson, who's the smartest guy I know who's not on the faculty of Carnegie Mellon, who's a leader in developing the an assessment was done by the Geological Survey offices of the 3 states as to where storage could happen. And in the Gulf Coast, the the storage is there and easy for people to use, and we need something comparable to that to be able to store the NGLs in the region, the raw materials for downstream manufacturing. And it also permits the opportunity for the price to be stabilized and so forth. So I can't speak to it nearly as well as Brian could, but it is an ongoing significant effort, and if that is accomplished, I think that that'll certainly be a turning of the tide as far as the future of downstream manufacturing in the region. It's a critically important piece of infrastructure. Happily, the Secretary of Energy, Rick Perry, has been very supportive. I was at a meeting in Morgantown when the Secretary came to Morgantown. We were all holding our breath, and the first thing he said was, you folks need to be like people in Texas. You got to add value to your raw material here in the region. You know, and everybody kind of breathed a sigh of relief and was afraid to say anything because he opened the meeting with where we were hoping it would end. But I do think for now the stars are aligned to try to pull this together, and that's going to be important.
So who's on the lead in making this storage happen? Is this a role for state governments working together, or is it industry taking the lead?
The Commerce Departments have been very collaborative. I think that's been important. I think eventually this will have to be funded through private equity. It's not an inexpensive development, and where the project is now is in the engineering stage. The Geologic Survey Office has proved that it could be done. Now the question is, where, and obviously this is going to be a long and debatable process to go through permitting on this, but the piping is underground. The storage facilities are also underground. It's not a noticeable piece of infrastructure for the most part, but it is critical. You've got to be able to move the NGLs around the region so that manufacturing can take place in different locations. But I think there is interest there is a storage facility in Ohio that Goldman Sachs has an interest in. So I think the potential is there for the private sector to get engaged at the right level. But at this point, it's still an effort to develop the engineering to show how best to do it.
Stacy, the Forging the Future report, were there specific recommendations in terms of what government or anybody else ought to be doing to realize the benefits?
Yeah, excuse me, there were specific recommendations. Again, you have this huge supply, but the regional demand is really, really low. And so the key question was, how can you build regional demand, more regional demand, so that the region really benefits from the economic potential? So one of the strategies was what Morgan said, just getting more natural gas into homes. The second strategy was around how to develop economic clusters where you can get, let's say, advanced manufacturing, data centers, users of a lot of natural gas that would want low-cost natural gas to come and develop these economic clusters. And that plays right into this region's strength, which is robotics, innovation, manufacturing. And so that was the second strategy was around those clusters. The third strategy was actually around advancing the infrastructure to export some of the gas. So there is so much gas here that probably you could never use it here, even if you had a lot of data centers and more crackers. So getting some of this gas to the Gulf Coast, which can link it into global markets, is actually also important.
So, Stacy, I don't mean to keep you on the spot here, but I'm going to shift topics, but keep you talking. Stacy and I are both participants in something called the Center for Responsible Shale Development. So the premise for that center, which is a collaboration between Chevron, Shell, EQT, Consol, now CNX, EDF, Environmental Defense Fund, and the Pennsylvania Environmental Council, is that if shale gas development is going to occur, then it ought to be done right. That is, with minimal environmental impact. In the center, through the collaboration among these companies and environmental groups, created a set of standards based on air and water impacts. So, Stacy, the question for you is, so why would Chevron participate in that? I mean, it needs to be said that the standards created by this center were in every case at least as stringent, and in most cases more stringent, than the state standards in any state in which Chevron was working, and true for the other companies also. So why would you do that?
Well, first I want to thank you. Jerry actually has served for 5 years as the board chair for this really important organization, and it's not always been an easy job, so it's been nice to work with you since I got here on that. And we can declare success, I think, Jerry, in that, like you said, that we have raised the standard, actually, the regulatory standard, because it makes sense for all of us to operate to the highest economic and standard, environmental standard. And y'all touched on this as well, right? I mean, emissions, accidents, pollution is not good for any of us, and it's not good for our industry. And so I think you'll find globally, anywhere that Chevron operates, we're operating to the highest standard that we can.
I would just add that the premise for the center is the belief that companies need a, quote, social license to operate. That is, they have to operate in a way so that the society in which they are operating believes that they are doing the best they can in their production. So Anna, we're at that point where we could allow for some questions if I think we have a little time for that.
We do have a couple of questions. So one of the questions that's come in is what do you see as the R&D and innovation needs for downstream natural gas use?
R&D needs downstream. Everybody wants you to answer that, Dave.
Sure, I have a good answer for it off the cuff. This is a very traditional industry in general. We're still 3 to 4 years away from product from the shale cracker. And once we get that, and there's an abundance of resins, plastic resins, we do expect to see a lot more R&D in terms of product development, customer engagement. But I'm not in a position to kind of predict which direction that's going to go. Maybe Michael could provide a little more.
Go ahead.
I can add a little something here. So Pat talked about the Tri-State Coalition and a study they recently put out. They also put one out last year at the same conference. And that one highlighted how Pennsylvania is really kind of well positioned to take the next step here because there's a college and a university, Penn State, Erie has the Barron Plastic School, and Penn College has a school that also focuses specifically on plastics engineering. And frankly, that was a kind of a surprise, good surprise learning for Shell. And we'll definitely see some opportunities to partner there with those two institutions and with their faculty and students and draw upon their talents to look at future R&D happenings at our facility.
Good. Pat and Morgan have something to say here.
I was just going to add and again, I don't understand the subject matter, but the McKinsey studies have recommended that carbon fibers and future petrochemical feedstocks would be important for the manufacturing future for the downstream because, among other things, they can be made recyclable, and that drives the price down to make it competitive. Carbon fibers are stronger and lighter than other materials, and McKinsey's report, at least to Ohio and West Virginia, the two that they've done, I think this might be referred to in the Pennsylvania report also, is that this is a clear opportunity for the region. As to the R&D part, I think clearly this region has strengths in what Carnegie Mellon is strong in. No one doubts the world leadership on that score. Who is really good in the downstream development of future products is a little bit more spread out. I know there's a German company that's looking that has a recycling facility for carbon fibers in the UK that's looking to create one here, and they get their work done in Oak Ridge. So I think maybe that's something we need to actually put some thought into that very issue. Who are the sources for the R&D for the future product development?
Yeah, and I think the attitude that we took with Carnegie Mellon was to basically have an open mind and listen. And as we began that dialogue, we were introduced, we basically said, any ideas and things that people are working on that you think would apply and make us better at what we're doing, knowing what our mission is, we'd love to be the sandbox that people played in. And since that time, we now have, I call them drones, but the autonomous flying devices that actually are basically flying along the bridges in western Pennsylvania that we have quite a few of. And a lot of them have gas lines underneath. And typically, historically, we would have folks underneath those bridges checking those pipes. These drones now go flying through the air and give us better data, and it's obviously much safer. We've also been introduced to a robotics strategy that literally through gas lines as small as 4 inches, a robot can go through and literally take photos of the inside of the pipe to give us a real-time depiction of what that looks like. And they also have the ability to seal joints, particularly in some of the older, bigger pipes. And then the last innovation that we've sort of been introduced with our relationship here is the idea of putting a fuel cell in somebody's home combined with a battery. I know there's a lot of discussions around battery, where you basically take the natural gas that we have the capacity to deliver to your home and literally convert it to electricity in your house without any combustion. And then that fuel cell, which is a very proven technology in big data centers and other technology, it's actually making it economic on a smaller scale. That's been the challenge in that industry. Through the partnership that we have, we're going to be introducing 100 fuel cells over the next 12 months into people's homes who would be willing to see how this works. But so I think, I think from on our end of it, we've tried to be, an open door to let others come and help us think this through. Because I think how we've done things in the past is changing so quickly that nearly everything that people talk about in this region, that Amazon's excited about, all these other things, traditional industries like mine can embrace and really partner with some of these, I'll call them really smart young people. So I think we're just at the beginning of it, and I think it's going to be dramatically, probably more quickly than anything, make us so much more responsible, and that fear that I started with, not only put that to ease, but also help you and people that we serve come up with environmental answers that make economic sense, that take advantage of this. And as you say, there's always some environmental impacts, but taking those next steps, I think there's a lot of opportunities for traditional ways changing and making it a much, much better path forward.
Thank you. Anna, time for one more.
We have a question. Is the increasing share of natural gas for power generation causing any shifts in your priority for replacement and upgrade of old infrastructure?
I think that's for, no, I guess it's for me. I would say what's really, we have changed our infrastructure strategy almost completely around the environmental impacts. I would say that nothing more has more impact on how we were and how we would have done it versus how we're doing it. What pipes we're replacing those old pipes with, and the ability to potentially serve more gas to our customers and bring more gas in, I think is probably an answer to that question. We are thinking of the future of this region, not the past, how we used it. So we've got building capacity to serve rural communities, building capacity to bring more generation online that historically have been using coal and nuclear, but then also looking at all the downstream opportunities to say, we're not replacing pipe for pipe, we're actually looking at what the future of this region looks like, and we want infrastructure to be in place so that as these opportunities come about, we can serve them.
Else want to weigh in on that one? Well, Anna, noting that the last panel ran over a little bit and bit into our time, how about one more question?
You've caught me off guard here.
Well, let me acknowledge that the moderator of the last session was also your boss, so I guess that explains some of it. But and mine, that's right.
So there's a couple of questions related to pipelines and the export of this fuel resource. So are there any plans on thinking about keeping that resource here for both people and workforce and productivity?
Go ahead, Stacy.
To restate my earlier comment around how large the resource is, the McKinsey study that we worked on did not model that it was possible to use all that gas here. And so it makes economic sense to export it out of the region. And if you can get it to the Gulf Coast, the gas can be liquefied, it can go on a barge, and it can go to any demand center anywhere in the world. And so, you know, I think it's better to capture as most economic value as you can in this region, and that's what if these strategies are successful, but it's actually, you can't use all the gas here, it's so big, is what the study found.
Yeah, I think one of the statistics that we saw, and I use this if I'm talking to Governor Wolf or anybody, and Pat, this is offensive to the regionalization that you've created, but if you just look at what's in Pennsylvania, the Marcellus and Utica, and just in Pennsylvania, it's enough to provide the United States its entire energy needs. So if there were no other energy sources other than this for like the next 15 years. And so there's a lot of gas here, and we're never going to be able to utilize all of it here. I mean, I think that's the obvious.
And I would just add, from an economic development standpoint, I said we're particularly interested in natural gas liquids. Our job is to bring more crackers and more propane facilities to the region to use as NGLs. The problem is it all comes out of the ground together. So if we want the natural gas liquids to turn into plastics to build manufacturing facilities, we need to bring the methane out with it, and we can't use it all here. So we're going to have to export at least some of it.
So let me just close this by saying, reminding you where we started. We're sitting on top of the largest shale gas reserve in the country and one of the largest in the world. If we're going to use fossil fuels, and many people at this university are committed to finding a way to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, but if you're going to use them, then you want to use them wisely and do it in a way that produces maximum benefit. I will tell you from my perspective, having interacted with all the people on this panel and their colleagues in this industry and in environmental groups, we're fortunate to have the particular companies that we do have exploiting this resource. Yes, there are environmental impacts, and they're creating them. There are emissions, there are discharges, but as you heard, and I've seen sort of behind the scenes, they are genuinely committed to doing it with the smallest impact they can have. Please join me in thanking this panel.